Hello and welcome to another crash course of climb. So today we have a pretty interesting topic, but before we get started, I'm going to do the usual intro that we have going on. So crash course of climb is something that takes place every Tuesday at 12 p.m. this fall semester. It's going to be happening pretty much until end of November, so I think is what we're going for. So yeah, we're kind of starting to wind down. I think we only have like three-ish topics or so left. So just if you haven't seen the previous talks that we have going on that we've talked about, just go ahead and hop on the UCF RWC's website. I believe on the Climbing Tower page, you can see some of those old videos. There's lots of great content there. So cool stuff to see. These are presented primarily by myself. I still don't know if I'm going to ask anyone else from the Climbing Tower to jump in on these, but if they're willing to, then we'll try to get them in here if we can. But for now, it's just been me, the Climbing Tower lead. This format is going to always have a topic of discussion for the week. So previous weeks we've had things like knot tying or modes of climbing, talking about gym to crag type of stuff. Eventually we're talking about climbing history. There's a lot of stuff that goes into these. So, it's always something kind of brand new to get on each week and kind of learn about. With each of these sessions, if there's people around for them, then we try to make them discussion based or instruction based. But for the most part, it's going to be me providing information. And again, yeah, that can either be, just more of a discussion about things or kind of instructional on how to do stuff. So yeah, that's kind of the format you'll see. Most of the time, it seems to be like a discussion kind of talking about, just things about climbing. But really the main purpose of Crash Course of Climb is to orient people who are newer to climbing or kind of trying to find their way and what they want to do and kind of give them the tools and the information to, learn more about the place and try to, not have to go seeking all this information on their own. So hopefully watching these videos will help you all out. Today's topic is one of my favorites. It's very fun, pretty technical and, but pretty by the book too at the same time. We're going to be talking about climbing anchors. So I will say we are not specifically going to talk about exactly how to tie and how to use these anchors. We're going to talk more so about the principles and the reasons that we have climbing anchors in the first place, right? So really we're going to call this an encounter with anchors, right? So anchors are instrumental in pretty much anything that you end up using a rope for, right? If you're outside and you want to set up a top rope climb where you just have a rope and you can just start climbing it on the wall, lead climbs, long multi-pitch climbs where you have to climb to a certain height and then fix yourself into the wall with a climbing anchor, and then bring a climber up to you, and then you keep kind of slingshotting up the wall like that. Climbing anchors make that possible. And there's all sorts of other places and reasons that you would be using all sorts of different types of climbing anchors. So really, a good way of thinking about this is that climbing anchors make roped climbing possible. Really, like you can't climb if you don't have a rope fixed to something to secure yourself to the wall or the climber to the wall or wherever you're going. So we're going to take a good a little bit here to chat about these systems. I do have a couple of climbing anchors rigged up right next to me that I can show as an example, but there are also a lot of great pictures here. So we'll try to go through all that stuff that we can. So first, we're going to start off by talking about, like what the heck really is an anchor? Like what quantifies an anchor? Like why are we using it? What's going on? So in this picture, I do want to at least at first say that you have two climbers here that are connected to an anchor by their climbing rope, right? So they've tied their climbing rope into a climbing anchor, which is really at the bottom of the screen right there. So we're just seeing the bottom of the anchor in that picture actually, but I mean, you can kind of see it's connecting them to the wall. They're basically just, leaning back on the rope and they're just connected into the rock, right? So technically what an anchor really is any strong configuration of hardware of some sort that secures a climber and oftentimes climbers, 2 to 3 to 4 maybe, to a surface really. Like that surface could be rock, it could be ice, it could be trees, it could be all sorts of different things. And really all the anchor is doing is providing a strong connection to hold on to that and secure a climber or 2 or 3 or so. So yeah, as I mentioned before, anchors can be used for top ropes. They can be used for belayer security if you do have like a ground anchor. So if you think about it, if someone's on the ground and they're managing the rope as a climber goes up or down, or they're lowering them down, when the climber does fall or do some sort of lower, then there's a certain force applied to the rope. Sometimes that can want to lift the belayer off the ground, which is fine, but some people don't really like that, so they might make an anchor that connects them to the ground, so that way they don't move, right? So we just call that a ground anchor. I just mentioned before multi-pitch belays, so that could be for rock climbing, ice climbing, or alpine climbing. That's going to be pretty much what we're seeing in this picture right here, where there's two people connected to the wall at the same time. They're both off the ground, and perhaps they're both going to continue climbing higher than that point, right? Maybe that's too going any further would be too long for the rope length, so they've fix themselves there so they can catch all the rope up and then start climbing again from that new point. Anchors are great for rescues, of course. If someone gets stranded on a wall, you might have a rescue team hike up and then set up anchors on top of a route and then lower themselves in so that way they can have some security and quick access to the climbers. I also put in here gear cleaning. This is more of a technical thing just for whenever you're climbing. You do put gear in the wall or you use gear on the wall. And if you think about it, you can't really leave without leaving something behind unless, there's stuff that's already drilled into the wall that's just there for you to use. So we use anchors to kind of, connect ourselves to a wall and, start taking some of our gear off the wall in a process that's oftentimes either lowering or repelling. We're not going to get into that at all today, but basically just know that anchors are quite useful for, retrieving the gear that you put on the wall to do the climb. And then one of the last things I have here is that anchors are great for big walling, right? So big walling is climbing massive, like 1,000-foot, 2,000-foot walls. And since they're so tall, oftentimes people will camp on the wall. So they're just, a couple 100 feet up and they set up what's called a portaledge oftentimes. And it's just like a flat surface, or maybe they'll set up hammocks on the side of a wall. And they got to connect those to something, right? Something strong and reliable. So they, set up a bunch of anchors, and that's another good use and a good example of using anchors on the wall. Yeah. So yeah, that's what an anchor is. That's kind of the definition of it, but we're going to talk about more of the anatomy of a typical anchor. And we'll even look at some weird examples of anchors and some common ones as well. So in this picture, I've labeled pretty much everything on one typical type of anchor. This is technically called a standard equalized or a pre-equalized anchor. This was one of the first anchors to come about, and it's pretty common, still used quite a bit today. So we're going to talk about the anatomy of this one because it does apply to a lot of other anchors, but not specifically. You'll find that, many anchors will share these pieces in this anchor, but they might have more features. They might even have less features. They might just have different features. But overall, most anchors will have all these components, again, with a few exceptions. So yeah, your typical anchor is going to have a master point. That's pretty much every single anchor that you would encounter or end up using is going to have some form of a master point. So what that master point really is that's the place where you connect the loads, right? So if you're going to connect yourself to an anchor, that's where you're going to do it. You're going to throw yourself on the master point. If you're belaying someone by connecting, a belay device to an anchor, so that way they can, if they fall or they do anything weird on the route, then it's going to be loaded to the master point. The whole point of the master point is to, collect all the load there, and then it distributes that load to all the legs, which is the next thing there. Every single anchor that's, considered good and acceptable is going to have multiple legs. And by that, I mean 2+ legs or so. That's just, we're going to speak about it later, but that's just in case if something does fail, then there's another leg that's ready to catch and hold the load. That's the idea. And it makes it to where each of the legs holds less than the full load, right? So if you have the master point holding someone's full body weight, that body weight gets spread between those 3 strands. Not perfectly, of course. There's a lot of minute little losses and differences, but it's going to spread it out somewhat to those legs is the idea. Now, there are some master points that don't have a shelf. What a shelf is really it's another place where you can technically connect a full load to. So I put a bunch of asterisks on the word shelf just because every anchor that does have a shelf that is different than this one, or slightly different than this one, there's a very specific way in which you connect to the shelf, and it's very minute, and there's a lot of thought that has to go into it so that if something does fail, then you're still connected to the shelf. So most anchors will have that shelf where you can connect something a little bit higher up and just separate it from the master point, which is this is often done to kind of reduce clutter and have some organization. So yeah, this particular anchor does technically have a shelf. Each one of those legs does technically have 2 strands, and you would connect to 1 out of each of those 3 strands for that anchor's shelf. So as kind of an example, just to explain how a shelf works, like I said, there's many ways to connect to a shelf. There's many ways to do it wrong. So we're not really going to get into that too much. But basically, if I have this anchor here, which has a master point and 2 legs, if I wanted to connect to the shelf, I would take 1 strand from each of these legs, and I would connect a carabiner straight through it. The reason being is that now I can weigh this, and if something does fall, whether it's the left or the right, pick up the other strand, this will still stay connected, right? Whereas if, I just kind of arbitrarily connected to the whole set of legs, just like this, and then, something fails, or even if something doesn't fail, this carabiner starts to fall through and it's not going to take any load anyway. It's just going to fall straight through like that. So that's kind of an explanation of what a shelf is. It's just kind of another option to connect things. You will find that every anchor has to have some form of protection. That's a non-negotiable. Like every anchor is going to have something to connect to. I mean, that's kind of how that works, right? So protection, which we shorten down to pro oftentimes, is whatever you're connecting to. So that could be climbing bolts, that could be trad gear, as we see in this picture. You can't really see the trad gear itself. You just see that the slings coming from the trad gear connecting to carabiners, which connect to those legs. It could even be trees. It could be ice screws if you're ice climbing. It could just be straight up ice. We're going to see that in the picture kind of soon. So, I mean, every anchor is going to have some sort of pro to connect it to the wall, right? So that's kind of the idea there. So yeah, we'll talk about some of the differences that we'll see in different types of anchors. I believe the next slide I have is like your three main anchor types. The sliding or Magic X, the pre-equalizer, standard equalizer. That's the exact same picture from the last slide. And then the quad, a very, very common example of a pretty great anchor, right? So I do have an example of all these, and we're going to kind of go over them for the most part. But these are examples of some pre-equalized things, and then also self-equalizing types of anchors, right? And we're going to talk again more about this. I keep alluding to talking about these things, but we are going to get into that. And here's a few examples of some unorthodox, kind of strange anchors, right? So in that first picture, it's just those are quick draws. Those are two quick draws connected to rappel rings right there, and the rope just runs through them, right? That's technically an anchor. That's what we would call usually a sport anchor, where you're not going to be using it a lot, but it's there and it's secure and it's good. We have two examples of ice anchors here. On the bottom left, you have something very complicated where there's like a quick draw and there's some ice screws and there's a bunch of random sling material and the rope running through something and stuff threaded into the ice. It's very complicated. There's a lot going on there. Probably lots of backups because they maybe fear something's going to break or come out, so they have lots of distribution of the load. In the middle picture, the big one here, we kind of have two anchors that are stacked into each other, right? So probably what's going on here is on the top pieces here, maybe they don't exactly like the full strength of those pieces together, so they made a master point, and then they had a third piece that's a bit lower, so maybe they couldn't reach it with their first sling that they have here. So just busted out another one, connected it to it, right? So now we have a big kind of compound system here. That's pretty elegant, actually. Next one we have on the top right, which I don't particularly enjoy all that much, I will admit, is just an example of a tree anchor. The reason I don't particularly enjoy it is because I feel like if you cut one side of that thing, then it just unwraps. So not the best tree anchor, but it is an example of the fact that you can wrap cord or material around a tree and then connect your anchor or whatever you're working with to a tree, as long as the tree is alive and thick and teeming with roots and stuff. All those are considerations there. And then interestingly, on the bottom right, we have an ice anchor where it's literally just cord going straight into ice, and then it has thick knots on the ends to stop the rope from sliding back into the ice, right? So lots of funky examples of anchors going on here, and they all are, they are anchors in their own rights. They have all their own pros and cons and extra features and limited features. So this is just kind of an example of the fact that there are a lot of anchors. There's a lot of ways to do them. There's just so much going on that we can't really talk about all of them. But we will talk about, the principles that go into assessing the anchor and talk about some of the common examples. So we're going to talk about Serene Anchors. The reason I'm saying Serene is because it's more of an acronym, right? So this is going to be an acronym that climbers use to look at their anchor and then say, you know what, cool, this is good. I'm going to go ahead and connect to this. I'm all right with this. So yeah, what a Serene Anchor is, again, it's an acronym. It's going to be in that order right there. It's going to be strong, equalized, redundant, efficient, and no extension, right? Or nominal extension, some people will say. And all that stuff is shortly explained in this picture right here. So I'll kind of go over that real quick, but we are going to go into each of those points on separate slides. So really the first one, strong, is exactly what it sounds like. Is everything in the anchor strong? Are the connections strong, or is the material strong? Is everything going to hold really well? I mean, that's super important, of course. Equalized is trying to say, is the load, pretty equally or somewhat equally distributed amongst the legs that are there? So that way, the force isn't really getting pulled to one direction or put to one piece alone. Redundant is saying that if any one thing, or maybe even two things, depending on what you have, if anything fails, is there something to back it up and then keep you connected to the anchor? You don't want to have one thing pop and then you're all of a sudden you're falling. Efficient is just saying, can this be done quickly with little material? You're trying to make this efficient. You're not trying to waste time on the wall. You're not trying to use more material than necessary. And then no extension is saying that if something does fail and it's backed up and redundant, does the load drop? Is there like a sudden drop or a sudden shift? Is there kind of a shock load to the system, right? So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and start with strong, right? So I do talk a little bit about bolts here, but we're gonna kind of talk more about trad gear in this one, just because the strength trad gear is more of something that you're gonna worry about. Now, I did include the word bomber here, right? So strong is saying that all connections to the wall are bomber. That is a climbing jargon term for basically saying something that's irrefutable, something that is just so good, so undeniably strong that you don't even have to worry about it, right? So if someone puts as we can see in here on the top right, those are climbing nuts, those like chunks of metal connected to wire. If someone takes a passive nut and sticks it into a crack and then it's a really good placement, they would say, dude, that's bomber. That's a good placement. It's a bomber nut. So yeah, that's kind of how that would work. The first thing we're going to talk about though is bolts, right? So in sport climbing, which is climbing where there's only bolts, you don't have to use trad gear in the first place. You should be kind of assessing if you get to a place where there's an anchor, so 2 maybe 3 bolts, and looking for rust. Is the connection to the wall loose? Is it the kind of bolt that gets screwed in, or is this one that they put in first and then they glue it? So you want to check and see if that bolt's kind of loose. Those are just things to check for and to make sure that they're strong. Most bolts are going to be strong. That's kind of the point of having them there in the first place, is that they can be put there and left there for a very long time and just be nice and strong. But every now and then you get on a route perhaps and that has old bolts, and maybe it's not the best connection for an anchor, which can be inconvenient, but it's better to be inconvenienced and figure something else out than connect to stuff that might drop. So yeah, those are just considerations with bolts. So in that top left picture, we have pictures of bolts. We really just use the word bolt to kind of summarize that whole configuration. But really what the bolt is it's both the bolt, which is the piece going into the wall, and then the hanger, which is connected to the wall. That's where we connect gear and carabiners and clips and stuff to hold ourselves to the wall. So yeah, those are all pictures of really good bolts, honestly. I mean, bad bolts would just be those, but rusted or loose or coming out of the wall, whatever. Now for trad gear, to make sure that it's strong and that it's going to work for an anchor, we might have seen on that first initial picture that I had for the introduction of the topic, is that there was an anchor that had like 4 legs or so, right? So why would we have like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, however many legs, when we could just do 2, because that's simple and efficient, right? Well, the reason is because we don't want to just trust only 2 pieces of trad gear typically. So it's somewhat customary, and some people have taken to something called the 12-point system for trad gear when they're placing it, right? Now, there's a lot of different types of trad gear, and there's lots of information that goes into how to place those things. But we're not necessarily going to get into that right now. We're just going to kind of look at some placements and give them point values, right? So if you think about it from a sport point of view, right, and a sport anchor, if it does have 2 bolts, we're going to trust 2 bolts because they're they're super good, they're super solid, they are bomber indeed, and then you can just connect 2 points to it. So if I have this anchor here that in my hand that I have, this has 2 legs. This would be something that I would use for a sport anchor likely. So I'd have carabiner here, and they both go into bolts, and then I would trust that, and that would be good. So what we're going to say here is that a bolt or a good sling on a tree is going to provide 6 points towards our 12-point system. The idea is to reach 12 points, and then we're happy with the anchor. 12 or more points, of course. If you have more points, then it's going to be an even better, like stronger anchor. But yeah, so bolts and good slings around trees. So we're talking like a nice lively tree that's not really sharp on the bark, and we have a really good sling configuration that we've set up around it, right? So just to differentiate, by the way, slings are going to be kind of your flat strapping type of deal. This is probably a little bit of a thicker one, so it's just like a flat nylon material. And then cord is just going to be kind of like thin rope, so round all the way around. They have different properties, different uses. Slings are going to be kind of good on trees, though. Now, the next point system that we have down is going to be 4 points, right? So that's going to be really well placed cams or really great passive gear. So I have a couple labels here for some pointers, right? So if you see that those cams on the bottom, the cams are going to be your spring-loaded camming devices. They have like those round lobes that contract and then expand into a crack when pulled down. That's the idea. These Metolius, which is a brand, these Metolius rangefinder cams right here, actually visually show you how good the placement is, right? So you see that kind of those colors there. It has green, yellow, and red dots on the sides. If you're within the green, then you know that the cam placement is pretty good in a parallel crack. So it's going to be a nice flat crack. So that left one, we're going to go ahead and give that 4 points because it looks like everything's pretty even and we're in the green zone. So that's a good cam, we'll say, and that's going to give you 4 points towards your 12-point system. So theoretically, if you have 3 of those, with that kind of effectiveness in the crack placed, and then you connect your 3 anchor legs to those and then make your anchor, that's a good anchor. That's going to be good for your 12-point system. Whereas on the right side, we have a cam placed in the red dots and it's kind of unevenly placed and it's not really going too well. That's going to give you 0 points, right? So that's on the bottom here. We say anything that's sketchy or suspect or just kind of there and you don't really want to trust it. I mean, still have it just in case, you never know. It might actually help you out if you decide to put it there. But we're going to say that gives you 0 points. We're not going to actually count that towards the strength we're trying to build, right? And then giving you 2 points or so, we said anything that's like, a really small cam. So those cams in that picture there are they're fairly large. They're fairly well sized. But some cams can get down to like that big, maybe the size, like the width of your thumb, even thinner. Those, they can be placed well, but because they're so small and they don't expand that much, they just simply aren't nearly as strong as larger cams. So we're going to say any sort of micro cam or micro nut, as in that top picture in the middle. So I guess top right and then the top middle nut there that has 2 points. That's a very small nut. It's placed well. It's in a good spot, but it's just so small we don't really want to trust it. That's going to give you 2 points towards the system, right? So as long as you can do any combination of all these things and then kind of get 12 points total, that's going to give you an anchor that you would think it to be acceptable, right? So yeah, that's kind of the idea of what we're going for. Just adding up those 12 pieces and then you get something nice and strong. You can go from there. And if you have extra and you're willing to add the material, it doesn't really hurt. That's not to say that you should, just add all possible things everywhere because that's going to take up time. It's not efficient. We're going to get into that as well. But yeah, that's kind of how, a trad climber would approach putting in gear for their anchor to make it strong. So yeah, now we're going to talk about equalization. So we want to make sure our anchors are as equalized as possible. So what this is saying again is that the anchor should distribute weight as equally to each leg, right? So if we look in that top picture there, if the anchor is pulled in the direction that it's supposed to be pulled, it's kind of straightish down, then ideally, the ideal case is that all 3 of those legs kind of take 1/3 of whatever weight's on it, right? So if I weigh 99 pounds, each one of those legs is going to take 33 pounds of weight, which is kind of funky to think if you think about it. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't really work perfectly in practice. You might have the 2 outside legs taking the most weight and the middle ones just kind of not quite tightened perfectly. But I mean, even if, something stretches or moves a little bit, then it might distribute it just a little bit more. Now, this is where the pre-equalized and self-equalizing talk comes in, right? So a pre-equalized anchor, such as the one in that picture or the one I've been looking at over here in my hand, means that you tie a knot and whatever direction it's going to be loaded is the direction it is set to be loaded, right? So if I've set this like this and the pieces are in these exact positions and I pull straight down, then this is the way it has to be loaded. The second it shifts over, then it's going to tighten on only one anchor leg and the other one is not going to be tight at all, which means that this load is going to be, this leg's going to be taking 100% of the load as opposed to 50%. So that's what this picture on the bottom is saying, right? So if you tie the anchor in the first place to kind of go slightly left, maybe your climber's coming from the left side, then, that anchor is going to hold, the weight somewhat at 50% per each leg. But for the anchor on the right, where you've tied it facing the load straight down, and then they suddenly take a left-sided fall or, the load's pulling to the left for whatever reason, then only one anchor leg is going to take all that weight. And if, that anchor leg ends up failing, then it's going to drop onto the other one. It's not really the situation you're looking for. So it's best to try and tie it with the load in mind for a pre-equalized anchor. Now, that direction, you have to choose that and you have to have some foresight and you have to hope it's going to stay that way. But the good thing about this is if, something does fail, then there's hardly any extension, right? So thinking about, I'll put this in my hand again. If I have the anchor and it's loaded and then it slightly moves this way and then this blows, this is just going to slightly tighten and then it's already loaded. It's pretty good. It's barely going to move at all, which means there's a small shock load to the system. But we're going to talk about, the extension towards the end of Serene. I believe those are the last one I was talking about. Now with the self-equalizing anchor, I do not have a picture of one of those in here. We saw them earlier. So we'll pick on the sliding X first, right? So this is a sliding X. I put limiting knots here so that way it doesn't extend too much. But basically what happens is if the load does shift with the sliding X, these are able to slide through on this carabiner here, right? So if the load shifts, it's going to change its position slightly, and then it's going to continue to load each leg somewhat evenly. Now, it's not perfect. It's not going to be instantaneous. It's going to take a second for this to shift load. So if something happens quickly, for a moment, one of these legs might have more load. But really what this does is it solves our equalizing problem by allowing it to equalize as it moves, right? Now, the problem is if one leg falls, you're going to have a slightly more significant extension. So if I drop a leg here, this is going to move probably a good like 3 inches or so before it stops moving, which is going to bounce on the system a little harder than a pre-equalized anchor. So yeah, that's kind of how equalization works. And we're trying to equalize, to make sure that, it's spreading out that load and not just shock loading one of our pieces, especially if we have, maybe 1 or 2 pieces in the anchor, which are not as good. Maybe it's one of our 0 or 2 pointers and we're like, I don't really want to load that. Then we wanted to make sure that we're spreading out the weight so it doesn't end up only on that piece. That's the whole point of this, really. So yeah, now we're going to talk about redundancy. This is like one of the more important ones for sure. So this is saying that if any one thing in an anchor just breaks or fails for some reason, then we are trying to have some sort of a backup, right? So we're going to look at the quad here. This is another example of a self-equalizing anchor. So I got this here. I'm actually going to go ahead and steal a second carabiner just so I can get all the points across here. All right. So with our quad, we got our 2 legs. We talked about having multiple legs, right? And these 2 legs both have 2 strands, and we have 2 carabiners on the bottom with 2 connection points, right? So we're going to go over all the possible failure modes of this, right? So let's just say a rock comes and cuts one of these strands. So we'll just dump the strand so that way it's not as useful. Well, then you still have one on the other side to back it up. Now, what if one of the bolts, such as the one in the picture, what if it's connected to a bolt and then the whole bolt falls off the wall? Well, we've tied knots and we've connected our carabiners to a couple strands. So that way, if the whole thing falls, these carabiners are still attached here, right? So that's, this whole leg fails, we still have this going on. Now, what happens if one of these carabiners just breaks or opens up or the rope falls out or whatever? Well, you have a second one that the rope's also running through to work with here. And also note that each carabiner is connected to 2 strands of this quad. So if any one of these strands fails, then we're good there. Now, if you really want to get into the redundancy talk, if you look in the picture that we have here, this is of a pre-equalized or a standard equalized knot. So not the quad that we had, but still the same kind of stuff going on here. You might notice that, hey, Josh, there's only 1 rope running through the carabiners there, right? And that is true. But even a single rope is in itself somewhat redundant. Climbing ropes are built with a core of strong fibers that are, somewhat stretchy in the middle, and then they're surrounded by a tough sheath, right? So if rock does fall on it or, something hits it or whatever, ideally it's only going to cut the sheath and kind of expose the core a little bit, which will weaken the rope, but still, have it there and keep the rope strong enough for you to lower or do something with. So even though it's a single rope, it still is, in itself, it's strong and it's prepared for some occasions of, abrasion or things like that. So even in that self, there's some bit of redundancy there. Now with redundancy, you can't always get the exact, like it's more of a level thing. Like you can't always have perfect redundancy in every single situation every time. Maybe you don't have all the materials that you need to make something perfectly redundant. But the idea is to strive for, redundant connections all over the place. The more redundant your anchor can be, the more secure you're going to be on the wall is the idea. So yeah, on this list here, I did already list most of the stuff. You have 2+ legs. More legs is going to give you more redundancy, technically, I guess. Carabiners that are locking in general are kind of redundant on their own. To make this carabiner fail, it's either going to have to break, which is difficult, but still possible. But to make it open and let a rope out, first it has to unscrew this gate and then also open. So that's 2 actions that it has to do to actually fail, right? So that alone, this locking mechanism, makes it redundant on its own. And still, we're technically going to use 2 of these on a rope just to get a little bit more redundancy. But for connection points, might only use 1. And then, yeah, so that's really, kind of how redundancy works. We're just trying to have backups for what's going on. So that way we're not connected to a single thing where if it fails, then that's it. That's not what we want to have in climbing. We want to make sure that we are safe or as safe as we can be. Nothing is really safe. And, going through good practices to back ourselves up. I do have a pupper in this one, but we're going to talk about efficiency for a second. So I've been kind of waving these anchors around. I've just been kind of grabbing them as they are. One type of efficiency that you can have is by having the anchor pre-built, right? A lot of people particularly enjoy the quad as a pre-built anchor, and the quad is indeed in this picture right here. That's an example of one. People will make this and then put it on their harness as is. So that way, when they get to an anchor, maybe where there's two bolts, they'll just clip it to each bolt and then connect themselves to the carabiners that are there, and they're done. Like that's it. You just clip it in, and you clip it into the wall, and then clip yourself into the anchor. Donezo. That takes like 10 seconds. Now, that's not to say that you should always have the anchor pre-built. Like that's just not always reasonable for some people. Depends on the climbing you're doing. Depends on the materials you have. So some climbers create their efficiency by just having, materials that are easy to use and quick to set up. So really, all this is just one big sling. And if I get to the top of the wall, I could take this off my harness. It's bundled up in some way. Connect each of these points, and then I tie a knot in the middle. That's going to take me like 20 seconds. Like that's not too bad. So just having anchors that are quick to build and quick to take down and don't have a crap load of carabiners, um, are really what we're striving to do. We want to have efficient materials. We're trying to use as little stuff as possible. We're trying to be as quick as we can. So really, that's just what efficiency is. It's just going to be a good practice for us when we make anchors and stuff. And then no extension here, right? So we have a image here of the sliding X failing and extending on the left side, and on the right side, there's a picture of a four-legged uh, pre-equalized anchor that we have there. So I mentioned earlier that no extension is kind of just an ideal case, right? Like we can't really mitigate extension perfectly, but we want to try to have it extend the least amount as possible while still performing the functions that we're looking for. So an extension is going to occur when something fails, right? So if our anchor is, nice and strong and good in the wall, we don't really have to worry about any extensions happening. But if something does, blow out of the wall, like maybe the nut slides out of its place there, the rock maybe breaks and releases something weird happens, I don't know. And then, the anchor is going to move and then drop a little bit. So with the sliding X that we have there, I mentioned it earlier. If I have, my two anchor legs and then this is chilling here, just like in the picture, if something fails, this leg drops. Well, it's going to drop a couple inches and then cinch down on the load limiting knot that I put here. Now, I don't have to put this knot here. It could slide down all the way to the end of the sling if there wasn't a knot here, but that's just going to mean that it's going to drop maybe even like a foot. And the farther that drop, the more it's going to shock load the anchor. I mean, it's like the same thing as when someone takes a fall, right? The rope's kind of slack and then you suddenly take a fall. It's just going to be kind of a quick jolt and it's going to be a bit of a jump there. It's just with anchor material, they don't absorb shock as well as a climbing rope might. So if the more the drop is, the more of a shock load you put on the rest of the remaining pieces of the anchor, right? So if there's a load and it makes one piece fall out of the wall, well, suddenly it's going to drop and create a shock load on the rest of your pieces, right? So you want to make sure first that everything's strong. I'm going to keep saying that, make sure everything's strong. But if something does fail, you want to ensure that the rest of the anchor is still going to be okay, even if something does fail like that. Now, pre-equalized anchors, they're really not going to do a lot when there's a drop like that. So there's going to be, that mitigated drop we talked about earlier. So if I have this anchor here and it's loading straight down, and one of these anchors falls, it's really just going to kind of swing under the anchor here. So it's going to kind of quickly move under the last piece that you have or whatever remaining pieces you have. And it's going to kind of chill out there. So not a lot of extension with those pre-equalized anchors. So therefore not a lot of shock loading from an extension. So these are all things to keep in mind. I guess in that left picture, again, you can see that there's, somewhat of a measured drop that they have there from where the carabiner had previously been. And that's, that's just kind of the way that's going to go. And then as a bonus, I wanted to talk about angles actually. So some people will say Serene A. I usually just say Serene Anchors because it's a little bit easier to remember, but the angles are like super important for when you're making anchors in general. So this is going to be kind of a physics trigonometry point of view. We're not going to get deep into that at all, just because these diagrams explain it pretty well. But essentially what happens is the wider the angle your legs make going towards their pieces of protection, the more force each of those legs are going to pull if you have the same load on them, right? So in the bottom picture, if you have 100% of some load, we'll just say it's like, I don't know, let's just say it's 100 pounds to make it easy. In that picture, there's going to be about 50 pounds going to each leg, right? So that's about as good as it gets, right? That's half of the weight going to each of your two legs that you have there. When you widen that out to 60 degrees, so that section part of the picture on the bottom there, you're going to have about 58% going there, right? That's because the more it widens out, the more of a horizontal component of force there is. That's just also added to the vertical component, which never changes because there's always going to be that 100% vertical component that needs to be fulfilled. So really, you're just adding horizontal force components. I don't want to get into it too much, but so if we keep widening that out to 90%, if you have a 100-pound person hanging from that, well, now each of the legs is feeling 71% or 71 pounds, right? So those add up to 142 pounds. We're getting kind of freaky now, right? And if you widen that out even as far as 120 degrees, then both the legs are feeling the full body weight of the person, which is, that's going to put you in a more precarious situation. It's going to pull way harder on your protection. That's going to put a lot more stress on the anchor material that you're using. So where do we want to lie, right? Typically, a climber is striving to keep the angle at 60 degrees or below, right? So kind of that perfect like equilateral triangle feel or below, right? 58% of the load in each leg, that's not that bad. That like the material can definitely handle that. The protection ideally can definitely handle that. So just kind of aiming for 60 degrees or lower is best. If the angle is too wide, then really what you need to do is get longer material to kind of drop that down, which we see in the right picture, right? So we have those pieces of protection at the top there. Just the lower you can get that master point, the sharper that angle is going to become, and the less load you're going to put down onto the anchor pieces. So yeah, that's super important as well. This kind of helps us use our strength without compromising it. So what is the most important, right? What have I talked about the most? What do I keep referencing the most? What's the end all be all? What do we want to strive for the most? That's going to be strong, right? I keep saying having strong things, right? Have strong connection points, right? So if you have just an anchor that's connected to really strong points, you have really well-placed trad gear, you have good bolts, you have great materials, you have lots of legs to the anchor, then, ideally you shouldn't have to worry about pieces failing for your redundancy. You shouldn't have to worry about extensions. You shouldn't have to worry about all those other things. We're still going to worry about those things. We're still going to keep those things in mind, but we're going to strive first and foremost to make strong anchors that, are irrefutable and don't give us any worries while we use them. So in this picture, I just wanted to kind of give an example of a really strong anchor setup. This is a big walling example. I mentioned earlier how in big walling you might be camping on the wall. Well, this is kind of what that looks like, right? That's a pretty disorganized version, I will say, but there's a lot of stuff that they have with them. There's two people and all of their camping supplies and all of their trad gear and all of their climbing stuff, and they hang all of that from the wall purely. Like that's how that goes. So just having good strong anchors such as the ones you see here are really just where you want to go. It'll never lead you astray. Now, so again, I mentioned at the beginning, don't just take this information we talked about and think I can make anchors now, right? You want to seek out professional instruction on how to make these specific types of anchors and how to assess an anchor and how to change it and be more complex with it. So if you are really interested in learning these things, find someone who knows about this stuff and then kind of sit down with them and have the anchor talk and just kind of go through, how to use these anchors and get onto it. So I don't think there's anyone here to ask questions right now. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at joshua.leyland@ucf.edu or drop by the Outdoor Adventure Center or give us a call. And we can always, answer those types of questions and kind of give you some more information at that point. But other than that, we'll be coming back again next Tuesday at 12 p.m. and we'll have another great topic to go over. I do believe it's the history of climbing. I'll have to double check that, but either way, get stoked for it. It'll be fun. So yeah, thank you for watching.